Welcome everyone to this new lecture series, Rethinking the University Past, Present and Possible Futures. The aim of the initiative is to increase the understanding of university governance structures, especially here at Cardiff University, but also elsewhere, and to provide a platform for reflecting on our current governance structures. So we have organized a seminar series spanning the spring semester, currently 6 seminars scheduled on various Thursdays between 1 and 2 p.m., unfortunately also in various locations, but you will see that on the flyer. We have invited a range of British and international speakers to share their insights about the workings of universities, both here and abroad, and to answer questions such as how have universities worked in the past, what type of governance models exist at universities in the UK versus continental Europe, and how could or how should universities work in the future. So in short, the series aims to provide a fresh look at an institution in which we all work, but not many of us understand. To round off the series, the Vice-Chancellor and other members of the University Executive Board have agreed to participate in a discussion event in which current practices at our own university will be examined.
Yay!
The seminar series is organized independently by a variety of Cardiff University academics from a number of schools and supported by the University and College Union. In order for UCU to be legally permitted to provide funds, this has to be billed as a recruitment event, so please consider joining if you are eligible. Thank you. So without further ado, I'd like to call on Martin to briefly introduce our first speaker. We skipped that? Great. So, okay. First speaker, Eric Lybeck. Very glad to welcome you to Cardiff.
Thank you.
Yay!
Thank you all for having me. I'm very excited to be here, to be talking about issues that I spend a good bit of time thinking about. I'm currently a Presidential Academic Fellow at the Manchester Institute of Education, and the field that I work within is an emerging field called Critical University Studies, and that's one of the themes that I'll talk about today. So the talk I've prepared is a bit general and hopefully just sort of sets some context. The actual issues of governance and academic governance are things that I've worked on. I do historical sociology, so I've looked at changes in academic governance. So hopefully in the context of questions and answers and so on, we could get into things like the decline of academic senates and the way different decision making has changed and so on. But the actual starting point I thought I'd begin with is sort of situating what I'm calling two universities, that there's sort of two different ways of thinking about the university at the moment, and that those two versions of thinking about universities aren't really talking to one another. And this is a space in which we can introduce critical university studies, and in particular a subtype of that, which I'd like to introduce, which would be civic university studies, which is really what I'm encouraging us to think about. And then that civic tradition, I think, could be one of many possibilities for hopefully thinking about rethinking, remaking, reclaiming the university in future. So the context for this is the Civic University Commission, which was set up by a place called the UPP Foundation, which is set up by a building company. So I'm sure you're all aware of your university builders and their ethical practices, but one of their sort of philanthropic arms has been to set up the Civic University Commission that recently reported. It was led by Lord Bob Kerslake, and it's an interesting report. It comes up with sort of 12 recommendations, and the major thing that they've identified is that universities in recent years have withdrawn from their local and regional communities and have sort of aimed for global research, sort of chasing particular league tables and rankings, all the sorts of stuff that we're familiar with. But they're coming at this and saying, isn't this unfortunate that universities no longer are engaged with their local and regional communities in the same way? And so they offer a series of bits of advice to that. And so I'm going to return to what they end up concluding, but I want to contextualize where this report and the interest in this kind of local and regional decline is coming from. And it seems to be rooted in this this broader shift that's going on globally, in fact. And this is a recent report by Thomas Piketty, who some of you will be familiar with. And this is actually just tracking a shift since the 1940s and 50s in which voting, left and right parties, so social democratic parties, right parties, and this is in France, Britain, and the US. So the fact that it's happening all across these advanced industrial countries suggests that this is a sort of global shift where politics, which would have historically been left-wing, would have been associated with working class, lower credentialed populations interested in social reforms, working class protections, and so on, and that over this period of time, especially since the 1970s and 80s, you have left-wing politics is now associated with professional classes and folks with educational credentials. And this is sort of an increasingly, it's about the tightest correlation you can get nowadays is educational qualifications and voting and those types of preferences. And this is individually the case, but it's also regionally distributed. And if you look at, for example, the Trump election, the voting for the Democratic Party over the past years has shrunk to basically cities, urban and metropolitan spaces, and then little islands, which are university towns and college towns. So what you're looking at is essentially a polarization of politics around educational credentials. And so this is producing things like the feeling of being left behind and so on, which is producing both the Trump election in the US, but also things like Brexit. And so this is the context in which something like the UPP Foundation is all of a sudden interested in why do people hate experts all of a sudden, and like why are people feeling alienated from the knowledge that we're producing? Don't we live in a knowledge economy? Isn't that wonderful for everyone? Well, maybe it is if you're included within the progress of the knowledge economy, but if you're outside of that kind of world, maybe it's not the best experience. And so that's one of the contexts going on. And this is producing something that I study in my research into higher education, is this long-term shift towards professionals and academics as a set of professionals, and actually a particularly important, although small in number, actually very significant in the whole organization of the knowledge economy, because that's where knowledge theoretically is based, is within academia. And so there's this sort of bifurcation going on. And just to give you an example of not many people saw, for example, the Trump election coming, but one of the people who did was Thomas Frank in 2016, saw that professionalism is an ideology for post-industrial society, and that although the Democrats still have this claim to represent working class voters, minorities, women, young, all of these things, they're ultimately the main constituency that's policy is organized around are professionals and those with technocratic outlooks and sort of the winners of the knowledge economy. That's what public policy is sort of organized around. And that's the manifestation of this is not just these kind of political upheavals, which are probably ultimately temporary, but discursively there's this sort of backlash, not against necessarily those professionals directly, but you can see within alt-right media, within various forms of even progressive and left-wing media, this critique of the academic discourses and the sort of label a group of hoaxsters put on this as grievance studies. I'm sure some of you have seen this. So gender studies intersectionality research, and you can see how awful and scary this way of thinking about the world is. But for some reason, there's this sort of growing hostility towards that type of knowledge, and that's represented as this kind of ideology of this professional class that needs to be resisted. And so this is a further context in which the civics university issue is coming up, but not necessarily the one that the foundation is looking at. And the reason that the UPP Foundation report develops a particular way of looking at this is, first of all, the way that they collected evidence was by interviewing vice chancellors and leaders and these sort of upper level of like, take me to your leader, and then the vice chancellor sort of said, well, as it turns out, I am the ultimate strategic leader, as you'll see from the website of them sort of triumphantly building buildings and so on, and so the Civic University Commission is sort of looking and interviewing what did these folks see as the issues inhibiting the civic role of the university, and it has a character that's typical of what I'm calling traditional higher education studies. And these have been around for a long time. They're sort of, how do you instrumentally figure out what works at universities, what's the best way of organizing pedagogy. I'm sure many of you have had to take these sort of academic like the sort of higher education academy type of courses, like the types of literature that you would read in those courses is this sort of, how do you encourage interdisciplinarity, how do you apply for grants properly. That type of research is what I'm calling traditional higher education studies, and that sort of informs the way that the UPP Foundation approached the problem. And that's also the way that universities who have now signed up to an agreement to re-engage with their communities are also sort of following this idea of looking at best practices. How do we figure out what works? Let's do more of that. And they developed kind of vague conceptual frameworks, often these sort of Venn diagrams of, you need to have strategic visions, you need to have key performance indicators of how much engagement you're doing. And this sort of, it's generally instrumental oriented, and it's policy oriented, and it's ultimately what I'm describing as sort of non-normative and ultimately centrist. It's this kind of an ideology that is sort of, we don't want to get into too much politics here. We want to make sure that it appeals as much to conservative as to labor, as to any politician, but we just want to do what works and leave the activism and so on out of it. So that's a whole genre, and it's probably the overwhelming genre of higher education research. So if you're interested in how universities are dealing with problems, whether it's the civic university or something else, this is kind of the way that a lot of the literature positions itself as. Now, what's interesting about this is that's a whole genre that doesn't acknowledge the entire other genre of university literature that exists. And this is what I mean by the two universities. Because there's an entire other genre during the entire neoliberal period, if you think of that from the 1970s and 80s, this sort of trajectory of marketization and consumerism and so on. And during that period of time, this other genre of literature about how universities work has developed. And you can go to the library and find any number of books, articles on this theme, and I can very quickly summarize the conclusion of all of these, which is neoliberalism is bad. And almost any book that you open is going to have a similar argument, which is neoliberalism is destroying higher education, and it's ruining all of different academics' lives, and we're sort of on this treadmill, and knowledge is being totally subverted. And I mean, the value of this is that that's actually true. So there's a sort of steady line of sort of truth. But this genre has been in existence for so long that the other tradition of traditional higher education research doesn't really even engage with this in any substantive way. So they're like, oh yeah, of course, there's another book on neoliberalism is bad, and there's another one and another one. And the way I think about this, and the problem I think with this is, although it's true, and although you can learn some things about how neoliberalism is bad, is I use the analogy with environmental destruction. So there's some sociologists, critical theorists in the US who study the environment. And they study that the rise of environmental awareness, the environmental movement since the 1960s and 70s, has increased. And the amount of information about how bad things are and how terrible we're treating the environment, that information, like, you can track it on a plot, and it just goes up and up and up, almost exponentially. And you can track identically the rise of environmental degradation and destruction happening at the exact same time. So most environmental literature says, well, what we need to do is educate the public more. We need more information. We need to get it out there. But in fact, this finding suggests that there's no relationship between more information and mitigating anything about environmental destruction. So I'm thinking about this in the same way. There's more and more information about how bad the neoliberal university is, and it has no relationship between mitigating the problems of the neoliberal university. And so there's a real disconnect there. And I think I'm going to argue that thinking through the civic university in a different way could be one means of sort of squaring that circle and starting to move on. So before getting to that stage, I want to introduce critical university studies, which is a recently founded sort of sub-study area. It's formally been identified in the US around 2012, and it drew on the idea of critical management studies, critical legal studies, and said, well, we're doing critical university studies. And there's a difference, I think, or at least I'd like to articulate a difference, especially as it's come over to Britain very quickly and sort of coincidentally, as I'll discuss with, for example, the USS strikes. It sort of emerged at the same time, which is very useful coincidence. But I'd like to articulate a difference between the university critique, because a lot of times it just gets assumed that critical university studies is the same as this other genre. So what's the difference? The similarity is the same critique of marketization, assessment, over-assessment, and auditing. The consumerist model is totally rubbish it's like that's not the right relationship between teachers and students and staff. Also a critique of management discourse and the banal words that you see and sort of strategy documents and so on. So it has that same critical edge and sort of critical interrogation of those discourses. But I think one of the unique things is it also includes a critique of the university critique within it. And in particular, the way in which this is not affecting change, so that you all of a sudden start shifting towards how do you take the critique and start to pragmatically, and even at a policy level, start to change these dynamics. And that, to me, is a distinctive contribution that critical university studies could add to this discussion. And I mentioned the USS strikes because one of the things that the university critique has argued for a long time is that academics are completely sort of quiescent and sort of keep passive and don't sort of do anything about these problems. But yet last year, at least under the motivation of pensions initially, but then very soon thereafter, I mean, I think you're all still here talking about governance and sort of continuing to think through how do we enact change. That's actually a new thing that has happened, and actually one of the things that we can think about is how to sort of sustain that momentum, to not just let that be an event that happened in 2018 and we keep our pensions or not or whatever, but how do you translate that energy and that interest in sort of reclaiming and rethinking the university, and how do you turn that into sustainable practices? And that's something I'm very interested in, and we could talk about more later. Now, within that critical university studies, there's a particular version that I'm advocating, which I'm calling civic university studies. And that's because I've developed a type of sociology called civic sociology. There's a journal that we've set up that is rooted in, it's kind of inside baseball within sociology, but there was a point in the mid-2000s when sociologists talked a lot about public sociology, which is another way of saying activist or politically oriented sociology. And they distinguished, there's also professional research when you do your quant and qualitative research. And then there's also critical, sort of internally oriented, like that would be the university critique version of scholarship. And so they had this interest in sort of activists and actually changing society, but also they distinguish themselves from policy. And civic sociology is suggesting that's an interesting idea, but actually we want to do all of these things, that we actually don't want to separate out those doing policy from those doing critique, and actually can we integrate all of these things? And I think one of the major things that this line of thinking adds is where we started talking about this political shift towards professionals and the alienation between regions left behind and this sort of professional education credentialed class, is we need to start reflecting on the fact that whether we like it or not, there's a polarization and we're on one side of that polarization. And we don't get the option of just sort of being these independent, detached, let's just go back into the ivory tower and just think about it. Like, we are genuinely under attack, and don't really have an option of even just saying, let's just figure out the best practices and do some more exchanges with museums and so on. Like that stuff's important to do, but there needs to be an actual political defense of what the university is for. And of those two universities that I mentioned, there's the really critical version and there's the really instrumentalist managerial version. What needs to happen is there needs to be a point at which those two meet somewhere in the middle, and that's where I think that the idea of the civic university should be going. So this is the kind of critical. Here's the worker. They're so well paid and everything, and then they look through their scholastic lens and see them in change and so on. So that's a caricature from the 19th century, but that's sort of the way that this group, and this as I would include university senior managers in general, when they hear a criticism of the way that they are operating, they just think, oh, well, you just don't understand, and anyway, you probably just hate capitalism, and why don't you go and read your Foucault and Adorno and go away? Right? And then over here, these people produce a bunch of KPIs and best practices and strategies. And this group is just a bunch of managerial speak. They don't know what they're talking about. But in fact, they are addressing a real problem, this issue of the local and regional dynamics that are happening. And they're actually, for all their flaws with graphics and so on, they are identifying a serious issue that we should start to think. And I think that the civic university is a useful container for something like a post-neoliberal university, and the reason I think that is that the university, first of all, there's a tradition in Britain. There's William White, the historian, has identified the red brick civic tradition as the main line of British higher education. That Oxford and Cambridge gets all the news, but actually the main thrust of British higher ed is the expansion and integration of local and regional communities. And knowledge, and that's actually something that we can reclaim as a sort of robust historical sort of legacy. And equally, I think that things like the USS strike is a missed opportunity by senior management, in the sense that you had real interdisciplinarity going on, you had real participation in a way that academics almost never get together and work together on things and think through how do we want our universities to run, How do we want to be involved in society, and so on. And that actually that needs to be tapped into and needs to be sort of continued and drawn out and needs to be institutionalized in something that reconnects with the sort of wider purpose of what higher education is for. So, and in particular, the idea of participation and having the time to participate in the way universities are run, and this is ultimately what connects up with the governance issues, is really academics and universities have been chartered and set up and are constitutionally organized in order for academics to be centrally involved in setting research policy and practice, teaching and curriculum. Like, I don't know how many courses have been constructed with just through marketing exercises and so on, but that's not actually the way like there are universities that are cutting philosophy programs and foreign language programs. It's like those are central disciplines to what it means to be a university. So academics need to get involved in defending something like what university and higher learning are for. But in order to do that, we need the time to participate in that, and we need the time, in addition to that, to also teach properly and to not be overwhelmed with students and marking and all sorts of things like that. We also need, we also need the time to then engage with wider communities, because it's not as if this whole tradition of universities losing their engagement with their wider communities. I mean, that's concurrent with the neoliberalization of universities, and who has time to go and genuinely engage with their wider community on pro bono work and these sorts of things. I mean, we barely keep our heads above water with the workload, and you know, I can only imagine if they put, you know, go out and spend 10 hours a week engaging with the community, whether that would actually get into, I know workload is a very serious issue. I'm here at Cardiff, and it's just the idea that there's any time left for any of this work is one of the reasons why universities have fallen. And I'd add that the UPP report doesn't really make any mention of this, and I think that's its biggest weakness, is it hasn't really thought about academics even being involved in this. And I'll just conclude with this last thought. Universities generally, historically, even going back to medieval times, consist of sort of three competing body agents or actors that sort of work together, right? And there's students, and there's the student unions, and there's the student body, and all sorts of things like that. And then there's the academics and the professoriate and the academic body and however they organize themselves in a collegial way or what have you. And then there's something like the university brand or the sort of institutional identity that's generally going to be run by some delegated authority, executive, or what have you. But they're also not just responding to themselves, there's also alumni, funders, local and government agencies. Like, there's a reason why there's a university brand independent of those other two agents. But what we've seen in the past few years, and the past decade really, especially rapidly, is the academic group as an agent in what universities are has basically dropped out. And you just have a university brand, and you have students ostensibly that the university brand is serving in some sort of consumer relationship. And what needs to happen is that the academics need to get back into a position where there's at least, at a minimum, a balance of power. It's not necessarily academics need to take over the whole thing and run everything as they'd like, but there's a reason why academics need to defend, for example, what the purpose of higher education is, what is a good education versus thin and shallow and meaningless education, and also to hold, for example, the executives to account. I mean, one of the things that we've seen is that this other, that the university brand has more or less not really managed itself very well. And if we don't do that, what's probably going to happen is what's happening in things like further education, which is the university brand will eventually just completely eliminate the academics as a professional cohort, and they'll just offer modules to the students, and it'll just be bring in a casualized teaching staff and deliver modules on a completely flexible basis, pay them by the hour, and it'll just be a relationship between a brand and a student, and so really it's quite important that there is a sort of turning point at which we sit, and I think that something like the USS strike was Carl Polanyi, the political sociologist, economist, would have called this a double movement. That when economists, or in the 19th century, this would have been business leaders, tried to disembed the market they tried to make the market something that was asocial and sort of not connected to society. And every time they did this, there was a double movement to try and re-embed the purpose of the economy for the social purposes. And it's just this almost automatic, it's almost like you could probably say a natural law, that when this happens, there's a sort of pushback. And I think that something like the USS strike and beyond, this is kind of what we see going on. And I think actually, from my experience looking at the sector, there's a number of different, there is hope actually that there's a lot of independent campaigns to reclaim governance. In Scotland they've done a very good job of this all the way up to the national level, but there's in Manchester I'm involved in a group for better governance. UCL has had an independent investigation, but I genuinely think what seems to be happening here at Cardiff is among the most robust double movements to try and reclaim academics as agents, and so that's really a hopeful opportunity. So I hope that you continue to do so. And I just really wanted to introduce these as just some thoughts, perhaps to set you thinking into the future, but also if you have any questions, I'm most keen to do questions and discussion and so on. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much. Great.
Sure.
That's a great kickoff.
Okay.
Questions? I'd start on
Noble was writing about digital diploma mills quite a while ago now, and that unbundling, if you like, was being talked about last year in the Lybeck conference, and I don't know what you think about that concept.
Yeah.
I feel a lot of optimism in what you're saying, and that's great. And I think my colleagues here just have full of admiration for the fight, which it unfortunately is, as you rightly say. But that unbundling thing is an absolute juggernaut, and I don't, you're standing in the way of people like Amazon and blah blah blah.
Right.
And people actually like shiny buildings and things like that.
Yeah.
Well,
Students
maybe you don't,
do,
but
yeah.
students do apparently.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't feel very confident about that.
Right. So should I just go with that? So the unbundling is well-funded, huge amounts of money to be made. So that's one reason why it's progressing so quickly, and it's on top of a general trend towards platform capitalism and the issues of Amazon and like you were pointing out. But I think what needs to be articulated. So the idea of unbundling is it goes back to the Clark Kerr vision of the multiversity and the idea of all these different functions of university. This is mid-20th century California master plan of Clark Kerr organized this idea of multiversity, all these different functions that get bundled together. And so then what we're seeing now is the unbundling of all of the different functions. So teaching could be separate from research, could be separate from engagement. And that's definitely the vision behind this, is civic engagement can be reintroduced. Like the government can start to, like they recommend a £500 million fund to encourage civic engagement. But that could be done by managers and specific employees who take what we produce and figure out the public expression of that. And that's probably what they'll do if we don't volunteer to participate in this, which is I don't see a lot of us doing because we don't have time. But what I think is necessary is actually, it does get to the core of what a university is. And so my initial research when I was doing my doctorate was on German universities in the 19th century. And actually, if you were standing in the middle of Europe or whatever in 1800, you would have not expected the German medieval collegiate model of the university to be the way of the future. I mean, it's like the most archaic, like ancient, totally dead weight of bureaucracy. Like it's not in any way modern. It's actually the most medieval version of the institution you can think of. And the way of the future at that point would have been the French model of the University of Paris, which would have been specialized elite schools, polytechnics, and everyone would have been separated off into their cadres of engineers go to this school, the military goes to this school, and political science eventually would go their way. And that's not the model that the rest of the world adopted. And part of what I research is one of the reasons they did that was because Germany started to beat everyone in the wars, and so they started to copy what the Germans were doing. But the wider thing that they managed to do was they said it's important for all of these functions and knowledge to be together. And research and teaching in particular need to happen together. And it's not just because we all want to be researchers and it's important for research to be done in universities. It's actually so that those who are teaching have their hands in the most up-to-date, cutting-edge research so that they can then communicate to the students. Like there's reasons why all of these things are bundled. And that's actually something that we need to start to say, is that there's no reason why technology, production, and all these spin-offs that are being created, why are those not being done by Google and companies themselves? I mean, historically, research and development would have been done by companies if they planned to profit from them. I mean, universities need to start to claim some level of blue sky research, some level of knowledge for its own sake, and that there's a value to that. That's not just for us as individuals, it's actually a public resource, that we do all these things together, and also that we need to do them together. And space is really important here because the way, like, the way we're all separated out into different campuses and offices and never interact with one another is like a major issue. I mean, that's unbundling in its own way. There needs to be the opportunities for these ideas to bounce off one another. If the university has any value, I mean, if a university is just anywhere you get a degree, and you might as well just start printing them and pay. And that's actually the way that we're going. We're heading that way. Yeah.
My apologies for the German university model. Martin, you are next.
I came to the German university.
Yeah. Me too.
Damage. You mentioned the lack of time. I mean, in looking in the future and trying. So the lack of, and I think we all recognize this. And I mean, the other issue which you haven't mentioned, but I'm interested to hear what you say is the way institutional arrangements provide for actually meaningful means of participation for academic staff within the governance structure. And we know here that the Senate has been completely sidelined or reduced to deal with a bit of teaching academic related stuff. We have a disagreement, that's great. But there's basically we had several governance reforms over the last years, which basically meant that academic staff has been pushed out of any meaningful decision-making things, like for example the council is a minimal thing. So do you think there needs to be, in your opinion, so the traditional institutions within university like Senate, council, blah, blah, does that need does it just need reform, or do we need a completely new thing
Well, I think that when I mentioned the three agents of the university, I mean the academic senate or academic board would be the place that academics would have some level of decision making, and historically there would have been a balance of power between the executive groups representing the brand, and then the academics, and then there's governing boards holding the executives to account. And if you track nationally, and there's been legal consultancies brought in, lots of times some institutions have rechartered themselves about 3 or 4 times, even just since 2012, to basically eliminate academic decision making because it's considered a hindrance, because you end up a lot of times with these guys getting involved and like messing up the strategic plan and questioning, like, is this really what we want to be doing? And then it's sort of, well, maybe if we just not listen to them anymore, we can just keep going ahead. And so there's that's been a hindrance. And so certain places have rechartered, but then other places, other universities have figured out that if you take statutes and pull them into ordinances, then you could just change them as you go. And so that just requires one rechartering with Privy Council, and that's actually much more common. And then once that happens, it's sort of all behind closed doors, the changes that get made. And very often what happens is there'll be collegiate and representative inside the original charters. There'll be things like the dean of the school should be a member of the professoriate from that school, which means that they're going to have ties to their department, and they're going to have all sorts of, and historically the heads of department would have been elected very often as well. So there would have been a built-in accountability, and all you have to do is look even at a really similar system in Ireland. They still elect the provost to the position. There's like a whole election and campaigns and all sorts. And there's problems with that as well, and because you could create like odd inter-university politics. But at the end of the day, the head of the university is representative of the academic body, right? Now, if you want to think about how you might change that, I mean, the history of it's a bit complicated, because in the context of neoliberalism, the first offer that was given to lots of academic boards in, say, the 1990s or mid-2000s was, you guys are so overworked, and you don't want to be sitting on all these committees all the time, and what we'll do is liberate you to do your research, and you'll be able to fly, and then we'll go up the league tables, and everyone will be showered in money and research and you just leave all the really boring, banal, technical stuff to the executive groups. And then it's only now, sort of 10 years later, that it's like, well, you spent our money on what? The buildings and stuff? And then it's like, we want to get involved again in governance because you've done not a very great job. And then sort of, but the constitutions very often have been rewritten. So one of the key things to do there, though, is just to go back to the original charters, the original constitutions, and say, how is it supposed to be set up? And we'll just undo these temporary experiments and treat them like they're sort of short-term experiments that haven't worked out well. Let's go back to the original version that had a logic to it. Like, these weren't just constructed in an ad hoc way. They generally had some even political theory behind them of division of powers and so on.
Nikki.
Really excellent talk. Thanks a lot, Eric. It's really interesting what you're saying about the potential for some kind of symbiosis between these two seemingly clashing perspectives. I wonder how you see the possibility of that coming about, insofar as that they are very, very different ways of looking at the world, and also quite a lot of animosity between these two sides. In the sense, the UPP stuff you're saying, that there is value, there are really important ideas, and they're focusing perhaps on things about the role of the civic university, which isn't necessarily the focus of us, for example.
Right.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this.
Well, yeah, so, I mean, the thing that I was struck by, and I wrote up a paper a because I was doing something on a series of book reviews, and the university critique doesn't mention any of these issues of the local, regional issues. It's actually very internalist, and it's all very, like, the overwhelming message is we just want to be left alone, and this marketization is making me stressed out, and other people stressed out, and I'm not able to do this research that I'd otherwise want to do, and so it actually ends up being a kind of very conservative position, which is like we want to be in the ivory tower and be left alone and be totally autonomous, and just expect the public to fund us to do that. And any attempt to audit and assess and all these things is sort of a burden on the pursuit of pure knowledge. Now, any historian of universities can tell you there's never been a point where anyone has just funded universities and said, don't worry about it, just like that's never existed. And there's also never been a point in time when there hasn't been an overwhelming crisis of universities from this group. This group has existed for like 1,000 years, saying all this interference is ruining our pursuit of knowledge and all the rest of it. Like, there's always an argument that the university is about to crumble based off of all these pressures. Now, what I think is distinctive about the present is how rapidly the particular model of the consumerists marketized higher education system was introduced into Britain since 2011 and 2012. It's happened so rapidly that there is a genuine crisis financially, certainly at the level of governance, and ultimately culture, internally as well as externally. That's happened so quickly that it needs to be undone in a sort of reflective, thoughtful way. Like, I actually don't think there's an option to go back to the sort of model of the 1970s and 80s. Not that I've heard that was that great by anyone who was there, but like there is no going back to the previous model, which is, I think, latent within this idea of all this stuff is ruining universities. And as a consequence, there actually isn't a thought for the wider world beyond a kind of vague social justice idea of like the world would be a better place if neoliberalism ended. But how does the world get out of neoliberalism? And actually, would academics and professionals be agents of removing this? And how do we separate ourselves from, neoliberalism itself is a product of business managers, economists, particular movements within law and economics. Like, there's all sorts of academics and professionals involved in the production of these discourses and organizational patterns that we have to figure out what is our relationship to them as well.
I think there's a third voice that's emerging, which is one which is about, for example, open source, about the commons, arising out of the USS strike and of working together online, offline. That is a potential for a bridging voice between academics and those who are running academia.
Well, that's kind of what I'm suggesting, is that you could come up with any name you'd like, but the one I'm suggesting is actually the civic university could be a space in which you would think through what would be something in between these two, and actually thinking about the future and thinking about adding something positively to the discussion that's like, what if we were all of a sudden engaged again with our communities and were engaged politically, not in a particular ideological position, but just active citizens and sort of engaged with the running of our universities, and actually that was a model for other organizations to be democratically involved in their decision making. Yeah,
Anthony.
Coming back, on that point, but also coming back to an earlier point, which was about German universities. You said about why German universities in the 19th century, bizarrely, ahead of any other universities in other countries, and people did adopt French over-specialised école, something like that model.
Yeah.
But wasn't that partly because there were widely held cultural ideas? I mean, the word around words like Bildung,
Yeah.
what that entailed
Yeah.
within that particular nation and culture.
Yeah.
And one of the problems I see with what you're putting forward is, what are our widely held cultural ideals?
Yes.
And isn't it the case that neoliberalism's so-called, I hate the term neoliberalism, but I know people use it a lot, so I'll have to use it too.
That's fine.
But this marketisation model was successful so quickly because of a lack of other ideals about what a university is for.
Right. Yes.
So there's nothing that corresponds to 19th century German Bildung,
Yes.
which we could tap into.
At the present, yes. I think I completely agree. And part of the research that I did into German universities is we tend to think of universities as modern institutions, as progressive institutions, but then in the early 19th century, they were actually conservative reactions to the French Revolution, and sort of they were ultimately an attempt to gradually reform society and to do so through education. So it was basically, instead of having a big revolution, we'll gradually educate people properly through Bildung, the Kulturstaat, and these sort of big, wider ideals. And so it was a whole political movement, actually, of which the university was a central part. And that got picked up by Americans and even the Japanese, South America. And that's one of the other reasons that it was brought. It was considered an alternative to the kind of radical revolutionary enlightenment of the French system, as well as an alternative to the materialistic, what would today be called neoliberal, kind of top-down rationalistic model. Because that's also part of what's going on in the 19th century. Now, in answer to the question of what's the English or British tradition that this would correspond to, actually civic is intentionally picked up. It's actually the Scottish tradition has it the strongest, this sort of civic tradition. And if you ask, there's the Reclaiming University movement in Aberdeen, where they did a public campaign and sort of said, well, how do you see your university? If you don't like the neoliberal version, what do you say instead? And the language of civics and engagement with local communities is there. And actually, if you go back to the 19th century when civic universities and red bricks were founded, there's also a tradition that was similarly anti-materialistic, and it was anti-industrialist and ultimately anti-Philistine middle-class sort of organization of society, because it was failing. In the 1870s and 1880s, there was a financial crisis that totally delegitimated the utilitarian model of how things should run, and a civic alternative emerged that started to pick up these types of ideas. And that's not very well articulated in national history curricula. So people that I'm thinking of are Matthew Arnold, Ruskin, George Eliot, a lot of the suffragists, Emily Davies. Those folks were articulating an alternative to materialism. William Morris and the Socialist League. So there is like a reservoir of historical, moral, and ethical traditions that is there if anyone cares to draw on it. And personally, I find history and tradition as being a much easier resource to tap into than to try and create, because otherwise you're doing what the managers do and making these strategic plans with buzzwords like innovation, disruptive, and
Delivering
it's
is their
like
favourite.
delivering, yeah. And it's like, but if there's already a pre-existing historical tradition that can be, so university settlement houses, for example, used to be a thing that, and women's education was central to setting these things up, public lectures. So there's a tradition there that could be, but I agree with you, it's not present, and that's one of the vacuum of that is one of the reasons why neoliberalism was able to go in. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
One more question.
Thanks very much, Eric. really enjoyed that. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what you think the role for students and graduates in working towards a university might be, and given what you said about the changing makeup of left-wing voting values, and also the extent to which you feel that students' civic consciousness is limited by the neoliberal, marketised, consumerised experience of higher education that they might be getting?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I suppose it's a question of to what extent have students adopted the consumer role that they've been encouraged to adopt. And there's pretty good survey data that suggests that the students actually don't want to think of their university education in the way that they've been told. And at least a good percentage of them, probably not the majority unfortunately, but a sizable, probably good 30-40%, want higher education to be about learning for its own sake. They want to have that experience that a lot of us would have had when we went. They are as committed to the idea that university is a sort of, for lack of a better word, a kind of sacred space in which it's kind of separate from society, but integrated in other ways, but in general, a space for reflection and discovery, and not just, you're the teacher, you've got the knowledge, give it to me, I've paid my fees. I mean, there's people who do that, but personally I wouldn't mind if they just went away, and they probably would if it was turned back into a sort of rigorous sort of model of scholarship. But politically, in terms of how I think there's a few things going on. There's students, undergraduates. There's also postgraduates, and in particular all the way up to PhDs, and then you're getting into postdocs and casualized staff. And that's a whole sector that, to my mind, the key to getting all of those layers involved again is a sort of reprofessionalization of what the academic idea of there being a sort of a career path and a trajectory that not everyone is going to go on. And you could go back to medieval ideas of what the university was for. Everyone was being trained to be a priest. And the overwhelming majority of students did not become priests. But the premise was being trained as if you were going to be a priest is a transferable skill in the language of life. So it was a good thing that everyone acted as though, and if you track the German system, one of the big changes was it changed to being a jurist and a judge, and that's actually, because that's how the bureaucracy was then run, was they changed it so that the ideal profession was a priest, and or the judge. And I think that there's a problem if we think of everyone should be an academic and everyone should therefore be a specialized academic researcher, but at the same time, I don't think it's a problem for the university to be organized around that collective endeavor of academics pursuing knowledge, and how do you do that well? And that's actually, if you get everyone on board, but then there needs to be points at which casualization, for example, I think is actually the most important thing, where people who enter the profession in order to pursue that, to then basically, it's really, as a society, it's really bizarre to me that you would educate this many people to an extremely high level and then kick them off of a cliff. It makes no sense to have that level of anxiety at that stage of life and all sorts of things like that. So those sort of reconnecting that life course model of the academic profession, but also just what it means to be educated. And you could connect that with lifelong learning and public education as well. So that's one tentative answer.
Right, sorry, that's all we've got time for.
No,
thank you very much. I'm sure we could have debated for another hour or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But thanks very much for having
Thanks
me.
a lot, Eric.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.